That is the first thing you need to understand about this story, because it is the detail that makes everything that followed not just tragic but inexcusable. Wendy Lynn Eistetter got away. She survived. She walked out of 953 Dominion Avenue with lacerations on her body and handcuff marks on her wrists, and a story that should have ended Robert Pickton's freedom in 1997 and saved an unknown number of lives in the years that followed. She told the police everything. She told them he had handcuffed her. She told them he had stabbed her multiple times during what the official record would later describe with the bloodless clinical language of legal documentation as an altercation. She told them she had fought back, had disarmed him, had turned his own weapon against him, the desperate algebra of a woman who understood that the alternative to fighting was dying on a pig farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. Robert Pickton went to Eagle Ridge Hospital to treat the wounds she had given him in the process of saving her own life. Wendy went to the nearest emergency room. The police charged Pickton with attempted murder on March 23, 1997. It should have been the end. It was not even close to the beginning of the end. It was the moment the system looked directly at Robert Pickton, saw exactly what he was, and decided that the woman he had tried to kill was not reliable enough to be worth believing. To understand what was lost in that decision, you have to understand what stood at 953 Dominion Avenue before the decision was made. The Pickton farm had been in the family 4 years. A working pig farm on Dominion Avenue in Port Coquitlam, the kind of property that exists at the edges of cities where agriculture and suburb meet and neither fully wins. It was not a place that announced itself. It did not draw attention from the road. It looked like what pig farms look like, utilitarian, unglamorous. The working infrastructure of an industry that most people prefer not to think about too carefully. Robert Pickton and his brother David had grown up on that land. They knew every inch of it, every building, every corner of the converted slaughterhouse that sat on the property like a held secret, every acre of the grounds that stretched beyond what the road could see. They knew the farm the way people know the places they were formed by, completely, instinctively, with the particular intimacy of those for whom a place is not just a location, but an identity. David Pickton had his own history with the law. In 1992, 5 years before Wendy Lynn Eistetter fought her way off that farm, a woman had told police that David had attacked her in his trailer on the property. She had managed to escape, the way women on that farm managed to escape, not because the danger was absent, but because they were strong enough and desperate enough and lucky enough to get out before the alternative became permanent. David was convicted of sexual assault, fined $1,000 Canadian, given 30 days probation. $1,000, 30 days probation, for a sexual assault on a woman who had escaped from his trailer on a pig farm. The farm was already telling anyone willing to listen exactly what it was. The legal system heard it and moved on. Robert had his own record before 1997. Traffic offences, 3 of them, between 1988 and 1991, settled out of court. Small things, the kind of legal friction that accumulates around certain kinds of men, the way weather accumulates around certain kinds of landscape, persistently, predictably, without ever quite becoming the storm that the pressure has been building toward. But it was what the Pickton brothers built on top of the farm's dark foundation that revealed the full scope of what they were constructing. In 1996, Robert and David Pickton registered a non-profit charity with the Canadian government. They called it the Piggy Palace Good Times Society. The stated purpose was precise and bureaucratically reasonable: to organize, coordinate, manage, and operate special events, functions, dances, shows, and exhibitions on behalf of service organizations, sports organizations, and other worthy groups. It was, from its first registered breath, a lie dressed in the language of civic virtue. What the Piggy Palace Good Times Society actually organized were raves, wild parties, gatherings that drew as many as 2,000 people at a time to a converted slaughterhouse on a pig farm in Port Coquitlam. The events featured Vancouver sex workers. They attracted members of the Hells Angels with the consistent regularity of people who know where they are welcome. They operated in the specific moral geography of a place where the rules that apply to the rest of the world have been quietly suspended. 2,000 people in a converted slaughterhouse on a farm where a woman had already been attacked in a trailer and another would soon be handcuffed and stabbed. 2,000 people who went home afterward and told no one, or told someone who told no one, or were the kind of people whose silence was either purchased or assumed. The parties were not a secret. That is the detail that needs to be held and examined carefully, because it is the detail that transforms this story from a crime narrative into an institutional indictment. The Piggy Palace events were not hidden. They were not conducted in the whispered margins of a careful operation. They drew 2,000 attendees. They attracted an outlaw motorcycle club whose members are not known for their discretion. They were loud enough and large enough and frequent enough that Port Coquitlam city officials eventually sued the Picton brothers for violating zoning ordinances, not for the parties themselves, not for what was happening at those parties, not for the women who were attending those parties, and not all of whom were leaving them, but for neglecting the agricultural purpose for which the land had been zoned, and for altering a large farm building without proper authorization. Zoning violations. The city looked at 953 Dominion Avenue and saw a paperwork problem. The women who went to those parties and did not come home were not a paperwork problem. They were women whose lives existed in the margins of a society that had already decided their safety was a lower priority than the testimony of a more credible class of victim. They were sex workers. They were women with drug addiction issues. They were women whose disappearances registered in the communities that knew and loved them with a grief that was as real and as devastating as any grief anywhere, but whose absence from the broader world produced, for too long, not urgency, but silence. And then the charge against Robert Picton was stayed. January 27, 1998. The attempted murder charge that Wendy Lynn Eistiter had made possible by surviving, by fighting back, by disarming the man who had handcuffed her and stabbed her and fully intended for her body to remain on that farm. That charge was quietly removed from the legal record. The reason given was that Eistiter had drug addiction issues, and that prosecutors believed her too unstable for her testimony to help secure a conviction. Read that again. A woman had been handcuffed. She had been stabbed multiple times. She had fought back hard enough to wound her attacker severely enough that he required hospital treatment. She had gone to the police and told them everything. She had done every single thing that the system asks of victims. She had survived. She had reported. She had cooperated. She had handed prosecutors a living, breathing, wounded witness to an attempted murder on a pig farm by a man whose brother had already been convicted of sexual assault on the same property. And the system looked at her and decided she was not the right kind of victim, not credible enough, not stable enough, not the kind of woman whose word a jury would trust against the word of a pig farmer from Port Coquitlam. So the charge was stayed and Robert Picton was released on $2,000 Canadian bond and walked back out into the world with his farm and his slaughterhouse and his parties and his particular appetite that the system had just decided was not worth prosecuting. Here is where the story turns in a direction that stops the breath, because the New Year's Eve party happened anyway. After the zoning lawsuit, after the legal pressure, after the city of Port Coquitlam had made its displeasure with the Piggy Palace operation formally and legally known, the Picton brothers held a 1998 New Year's Eve party at the farm. They held it with the flat defiance of men who had learned, through years of legal encounters that resolved in their favor or dissolved against insufficient evidence, that consequences were theoretical. The police response was to issue an injunction banning future parties, with authorization for officers to arrest and remove any person attending future events at the farm, not to search the farm, not to investigate what had been happening there, not to ask the question that the combination of a stayed attempted murder charge, a prior sexual assault conviction, 2,000-person parties in a converted slaughterhouse, and the growing number of missing women from Vancouver's downtown east side should have been demanding someone ask, just an injunction, a legal document telling to men who had already demonstrated their relationship with legal documents that they were not allowed to have any more parties. The Piggy Palace Good Times Society, in its non-profit status the following year for inability to produce financial statements, it was disbanded. The farm got quieter, the parties stopped, and the women who had been going to those parties and not coming home continued not coming home. The missing women. That is what they were called in Vancouver. The missing women of the downtown east side. A designation that captured the fact of their absence without capturing anything of who they were. They had names. They had families who searched for them and waited for them and filed missing persons reports that accumulated in filing systems without producing action proportional to the number of women disappearing from a specific geographic area over a specific period of time. They were sex workers, many of them, women whose lives had been shaped by addiction and poverty, and the particular vulnerability of people who exist in the spaces where society's safety nets have already failed. They were not the kind of missing women whose disappearances produce the media attention and investigative urgency that the disappearances of other kinds of women immobily produce. They were the kind of missing women who got filed. The pig farm on Dominion Avenue sat at the center of the geographic and temporal pattern of their disappearances, like an answer that nobody was asking the right question to reach. Women went to the farm. Women went to the parties. Women did not come back. The pattern was visible to the people in the communities where these women lived, to other sex workers, to outreach workers, to the advocates who had been raising alarms about the missing women 4 years before any official investigation reached the scale the situation demanded. Those alarms were heard and assessed and determined to be insufficient to redirect investigative resources. Wendy Lynn Eistetter had already told them. That is the fact that sits at the center of this story and was stone that cannot be moved. In 1997, a living woman walked into a police station with wounds on her body and handcuff marks on her wrists and told investigators exactly what Robert Pickton had done to her and where he had done it. She had given them the farm. She had given them the slaughterhouse. She had given them the man with the handcuffs and the knife and the particular violence of someone who expected his victims to remain on his property permanently. She had given them everything except the bodies, because she was the one who had refused to become one, and they had taken her testimony and weighed it against her addiction and decided that the scales did not balance in her favor. The women who disappeared after January 27, 1998, after the charge was stayed, after Pickton walked out on $2,000 bond, after the system made its calculation about the value of Wendy's word, those women paid the price of that calculation with their lives. That is not metaphor. That is not rhetorical weight applied to a legal decision. That is the direct and documentable consequence of a prosecutorial choice made on a specific date in a specific city about a specific woman's worth as a witness. The farm was finally searched in 2002. What investigators found there, in the soil and the buildings and the cold, operational infrastructure of a place that had been hiding in plain sight for years, while 2,000 people danced in its converted slaughterhouse, and city officials sued its owners for zoning violations, and a prosecutor decided a wounded woman's word was not worth the risk of a trial. What they found there was the answer to every question the missing women's families had been asking for years. Robert Pickton was arrested. He was charged. He was tried. He was convicted in 2007 of 6 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The investigation into his activities is considered one of the largest and most complex in Canadian history. 26 women are confirmed to have been murdered. The actual number is believed to be higher. 26 women, at minimum, after a living survivor had walked into a police station in 1997 and handed investigators everything they needed to stop him. There is a specific kind of institutional betrayal that does not announce itself as betrayal. It announces itself as procedure, as prosecutorial discretion, as the reasonable assessment of the evidentiary strength of a case by professionals trained to make exactly these kinds of determinations. It wears the language of the system and speaks in the measured tones of people doing their jobs within established frameworks and making the calls that their position requires them to make. And then 26 women are dead on a pig farm, and the woman who survived is still alive somewhere, carrying in her body the scars of a night on Dominion Avenue when she fought hard enough and fast enough and desperately enough to take a weapon away from a man who had handcuffed her. And she has to live in the knowledge that she told them, that she gave them everything, that she was there and she was wounded, and she was telling the truth, and they looked at her and saw a liability rather than a witness. She survived Robert Pickton. Wendy Lynn Eistetter survived him completely and absolutely. She took his knife and she walked out of that farm, and she went to the police and she told the truth. The system did not survive its own response to her. 953 Dominion Avenue is gone now. The farm was demolished. The slaughterhouse where 2,000 people danced, while the ground around them held secrets that nobody with the authority to look was looking for, gone. The pig pens, the outbuildings, the converted spaces where the Piggy Palace Good Times Society held its events until a zoning injunction told it to stop, gone. The physical infrastructure of one of Canada's most prolific serial killings has been removed from the landscape of Port Coquitlam. But the address remains, the way addresses always remain, even when the buildings are gone and the ground has been cleared and the city has moved whatever came after into the space where something unspeakable used to stand. The address remains as a coordinate, a fixed point in the geography of what happened, and what was allowed to happen, and what was ignored long enough to become catastrophic. 26 confirmed names, at minimum. Each one a woman who had a life and a history, and people who loved her, and the full irreducible weight of a human being. Each one a woman whose disappearance was noted, and filed and assessed as insufficient to generate the investigative response that a pig farm on Dominion Avenue and a stayed attempted murder charge and a pattern of missing women from a specific neighborhood had been demanding 4 years. Wendy Lynn Eistetter fought her way off that farm with her hands and her will and the desperate physics of a woman who refused to become a statistic on a property that was already full of them. She told the police she was not believed in the way that mattered, in the way that produces action, in the way that locks a door between a dangerous man and the world he is dangerous in. And Robert Pickton walked back to his farm and his slaughterhouse and his parties and his darkness, and the women kept going there, and the women kept not coming home, and the files kept accumulating, and the advocates kept raising alarms, and the city kept suing over zoning violations, and the Hells Angels kept attending the parties, and the prosecutor's decision about Wendy Lynn Eistetter's credibility kept costing lives that it was never supposed to be allowed to cost. 26 women, at minimum, after a survivor told the truth in 1997. The farm is gone, the slaughterhouse is gone, the Piggy Palace Good Times Society is disbanded and forgotten. Robert Pickton is in a Canadian federal prison. He will not be eligible for parole until he is in his 80s. Wendy Lynn Eistetter survived. She fought and she survived, and she told the truth, and the truth was not enough, and she survived anyway. With everything that survival costs, when the system uses your wounds as a reason to look away rather than a reason to act. 26 women did not survive, because in 1998 a prosecutor weighed a wounded woman's word and found it insufficient. The farm on Dominion Avenue kept its secrets for 5 more years after that decision. It should never have been allowed to keep them at all.